You know, that really is the most boring poster in the entire original trilogy. Found this one on Pinterest that's in the slightly more modern style, but quite frankly, that's just a different kind of boring. A Marvel movie inspired kind of boring, where it's just the cast members arrayed around a central image. And then there's the Japanese poster. Still boring, but at least it's thematically appropriate. The original RoboCop asked, among many other things, just how many body parts a person could lose and still reasonably pass for human. RoboCop 3 forces us to ask, among many other things, actually not really that many, how much of the original RoboCop team we can lose and still reasonably expect to get ourselves a RoboCop movie. Newmeyer and Miner, gone. Verhoeven, long gone. And even the man in the machine himself, Peter Weller, also chose not to return for a third go-round. Though he's on record saying he only did RoboCop 2 because they backed a whole truckload of money up his driveway. Replaced by Robert John Burke, who is, he's alright. He's fine. Plays Murphy a little bit more mechanical than his predecessor did in some scenes. But in others, he gets some of the best RoboCop one-liners in the entire franchise. Thank you. I hope you are insured. Go home, young lady. You are in violation of curfew. And I've always loved the pregnant yes he gives Sergeant Reed when Sergeant Reed tells him there's a warrant out for his arrest. And at the very end, the main villain asks him, "How can I help you, officer?" in one of this film's infrequent attempts at parallelism. And Murphy gives the most truthful answer any cop has ever given anyone, by resisting arrest. Of the original cast, only Nancy Allen, Robert Doquey, and Felton Perry remain. And they're all fine. But just like last time, what they have to work with is spectacularly less so. At least Basil Polidoris is back on the ones and twos, so we can all rock out to his most excellent RoboCop theme once again. No disrespect to Leonard Rosenman. Like everyone else with 2 ears and a brain, I loved his work on Star Trek IV. But his soundtrack to RoboCop 2 sounds like it's both trying to build up to Polidoris' original theme and deliberately trying to avoid it for some strange reason. The result, at least to me, is basically the musical equivalent of Blue Balls. Until the very end, when he brings in a chorus just to shout RoboCop over and over again. And that, at least, is funny. Polidoris writes some new stuff here, combining it with slight remixes of his old stuff. And it's about the only thing in this film that I can call unalloyed good. A lifeline of familiarity in a swirling sea of change. Inexplicable unless you know what was going on behind the scenes. As I've hinted at over these last 2 reviews, Orion Pictures was going bankrupt as this movie entered production. 2 Academy Award winners in a year, Dances with Wolves and Silence of the Lambs, were not enough to save it from the previous half-decade's worth of box office disappointments. RoboCop 2 included, sadly. Or its mountains of outstanding debt. The not-so-secret sauce in the otherwise tasteless Big Mac that is the American economy. Even in 1993, debt was about the only thing we manufactured anymore, apart from weapons of mass destruction. And if you think that's a bad thing, then get prepared to be called communist by people who don't know what that means, and just use it as a synonym for everything they don't like. Even this film, bastardized low-budget sequel though it may be, is aware of the problem with structuring an entire economy based around debt. Which is why OCP, seemingly unassailable villain of the franchise, begins this movie on the verge of bankruptcy. Either they break ground on Delta City by the absurd pace-dictating deadlines they agreed to sometime between movies, or their loans will get called in, and that's ballgame. Time to call in the militarized SWAT team, fresh from the front lines of the Amazon Wars. Clear out old Detroit's even more numerous than last time population. I said I was going to explain where SWAT teams came from, didn't I? Well, I kind of misremembered this movie and felt it would be a more appropriate place to talk about it here than in the already overstuffed review of RoboCop 1. But the short answer is, in 1962, President Kennedy created the Office of Public Safety, a subsidiary of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is itself a subsidiary of the CIA. For over a decade, the OPS trained, armed, and handed out pallets of cash to police forces all over the world, but especially up and down Central America. All in the name of fighting the Cold War by teaching local cops the fine art of imprisoning, torturing, or outright disappearing anyone to the political left of Richard Nixon. And getting away with it too, since the only people who cared were other filthy godless commies. Though that's not actually true. Most of the reason we know any of this is because local priests were, and remain, very good note-takers. So, shout out to all you Jesuits out there. A few years later, back in the United States, something happened that I still have to call the Watts riots, so people know what I'm talking about. Even though, my circles, we would tend to call it the Watts uprising. Whatever you call it. The fact remains that after years of ambient and outright racism from the already notorious at the time LAPD, the residents of the Watts neighborhood started fist-fighting with the cops on August 11th, 1965. LAPD Chief Bill Parker immediately panicked, called in the National Guard, and by the time the dust settled, 34 people were dead. One firefighter died doing their job. There are certain risks that come with the territory. And 2 cops got shot by other cops who were attempting to shoot civilians. Meanwhile, the LAPD managed to kill 23 people, and the National Guard racked up another 7. But facts don't matter so much as what you do with them afterwards. And for a brief, shining moment, the entire government of California, from Governor Pat Brown on down, united to project an image to the rest of the world of cops being overwhelmed by armed and apparently organized domestic insurgents, some of whom might have even been communist, just like in Vietnam, which was already heating up at the time, this being just over a year after the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened, or didn't happen, or kinda happened, but also kinda didn't happen at the same time, as the case may be. So the Watts riots became an excuse to give cops all around the country a ton of money, the better to protect them from the people that they themselves were sworn to protect. To combat the communist werewolves supposedly lurking inside the hearts and minds of all their fellow citizens, with special weapons and tactics. Hence, SWAT. Congress officially shut down the Office of Public Safety in 1974, during a brief period when Congress actually started to care about all the horrible shit the CIA gets up to on the regular. But it was okay. All those former OPS employees landed on their feet. After all, by 1974, SWAT teams were popping up all over the nation, and somebody had to train them. So these days, whenever, say, one of the original Black Lives Matter activists in Ferguson turns up dead in a car that they somehow managed to set on fire after shooting themselves in the face, I think back to Honduras in the 50s, or Brazil in the 60s, or Argentina in the 70s. And even the Amazon War, lurking in the background of these RoboCop movies. Must be going real well if OCP can just hire people out of it and deploy them to the streets of Detroit, rechristening them as an urban rehabilitation, or rehab team. Then again, there was that story about the nuclear power plant last time. Supposedly, 5 years have passed since RoboCop 2, but I don't know where that information comes from. It's certainly not in the text that I can see. What I do know is somebody either read the book, Rising Sun, or just absorbed the hype around it through osmosis. Because here, the OCP taking over Detroit subplot, so central to the last two movies, is almost completely replaced by a subplot about OCP itself getting taken over by, as they say in the film, the Japanese Katamitsu Corporation. Thanks for the extra adjective there. With a name like Katamitsu, I was worried they might be French. Perhaps this is the last remnant of comic book writer Frank Miller's work on these films. Because if there's anything he loves more than dystopian urban hellscapes, it's ninjas. I should save this for a Rising Sun review, or a whole-ass Michael Crichton retrospective, but the real irony is, by November 1993, when RoboCop 3 finally hit theaters, both the stock market and housing market bubbles that had powered the Japanese economy throughout the 80s had well and truly popped. Prices were cratering, and Japan was well on its way to what used to be called the Lost Decade, and is now called the Lost Score, or the Lost 20 Years. A general period of economic depression and malaise, where everyone slowly but steadily realized that all their former dreams were dead, and that their political system was not just incapable, but completely unwilling to do anything about it except prop up the next stock market and real estate bubble. If you were a conscious being in these United States between the years of 2007 and 2009, you might have some idea of what all that was like. Just imagine that stretched out for 20 goddamn years. Oh wait, you don't actually have to, unless you're already too big to fail. But at least now you know why everybody stopped talking about the possibility of Japan taking over the world around 1994-ish, and certainly after 1997, when a region-wide economic crash made everything worse. But hey, at least we got Evangelion and the 90s Gamera trilogy out of it. Rising Sun, the movie, tried to get out of being called racist by changing the ending of the book so that it turned out that a white American actually did the murder most foul that kicks off the plot. Or did he? Dun dun dun. RoboCop 3 tries to get out of being called racist by... well, let's be honest, by being the second sequel to a movie that, while successful, still was pretty low on the pecking order of post-Star Wars blockbusters and had to become a cult hit that could pass for a documentary in order to get any respect whatsoever, really. But also by having the not actually Japanese at all Remy Ryan play our Japanese-American protagonist, Nico. A computer engineering child prodigy who can, and will, over the course of this film, hack literally anything. Because if your stereotypes are positive, they suddenly, magically stop being stereotypes. I guess, was the thought process in the 90s, and still is in some corners today. Of course, without her electronic acumen, Nico would have even less characterization than she does already, and even less of a reason to be in this film. Oh, she's a child RoboCop fan. Well, join the club with the fucking rest of us. Roger Ebert really did waste his criticism about tykes being shoehorned into RoboCop movies so the kiddies at home can have someone to identify with on the last film. All the lady hackers I show this movie to nowadays are too busy identifying with Murphy to really give much of a crap about his second surrogate child in as many films. And back in the 90s, all of them had the ultimate lady hacker role model in Barbara Gordon, provider of tech support to the Gotham City vigilante community and eventually the entire Justice League. A position she still holds today in some dimensions. New gods bless them and keep them. Granted, Murphy and Nico's relationship is at least a little more developed than Murphy and Hobbs. By which I mean it lasts more than one scene. Like 2 scenes. They give us a glimpse at Murphy's parenting skills, which, all things considered, not so bad. He was a dork dad, was our Alex Murphy, and I'm sure his jokes were endearingly cringe. But about the only interesting thing he says to Nico is when he's trying not to tell her what he knows about what happened to her parents. That they were taken to an OCP concentration camp. Oops, sorry, I mean rehab center. And killed while attempting escape. Which, if you remember them, Murphy says to Nico, they're never really gone. And coming from you, Murph, that's fucking something. You're the one who barely remembers your old family, except in intermittent flashbacks. And your corporate masters made you tell your wife, to her face no less, that you were gone at the start of the last film. Did you ever do anything to correct that? Oh, we'll never know, since it never comes up in this picture? And she only shows up in a dream sequence where she morphs into your two work wives? Nothing weird going on about that, no. RoboCop 3 also tries to get out of being racist by having Shakespearean veteran of stage and screen John Castle play our main on-the-ground antagonist, Paul McDaggett, commander of the rehabs. But he's sleepwalking his way through material that he obviously felt was beneath him. But it also sees the Katamitsu Corporation deploy an android ninja, a ninja Terminator in all but name, to the streets of Detroit, charged with hunting down the leadership of the popular domestic insurgency that's risen to oppose OCP's forced removal program. Led by, among others, future Amanda Waller, CCH Pounder. The Ninja Terminator's name is Automo, and he's so good at passing for human, he can smoke. The logistics of this might just break my brain if I think about it too hard for too long. Real Terminators took until the Sarah Connor Chronicles to be able to eat so much as a chip, but here's Katamitsu Corp in alternate 1993, making an android who can smoke, seemingly for no other reason than it'll look cooler when he's looming against a window. He certainly has fuck all else to do but look cool. By the time he catches up with the popular domestic insurgency, they've already been killed by McDaggett's rehabs. And his fight with RoboCop is both too short and inexplicably boring. Inexplicably, that is, unless you know they hired Automo's actor for his looks and nothing else. Either RoboCop 3 couldn't find a Japanese-American actor with some martial arts skills who looked as cool in that suit and those shades, which I don't believe, or they ran out of time to search for one, or money to pay them. Or both. Probably both. It would have been nice if they'd saved the whole RoboCop fights an evil RoboCop climax for this movie. And that may have, in fact, been the original plan. But they probably still would have found some way to fuck it up, like putting Dr. Fax's brain in RoboCop 2's body. Or by running out of time and money to do a proper stop-motion fight scene. As they ran out of money to do a proper RoboCop versus Ninja Terminator fight scene. Apparently, they only had the time, or the cash, to do one take of that shot at the end, where the two Automos cut each other's heads off. Regardless, both RoboCop versus Ninja Terminator and RoboCop versus generic British action movie villain number 4783 feel like de-escalations of the conflict from the already dubious heights of RoboCop versus RoboCane. Kane, who wasn't even smart enough to move his drug lab after RoboCop found it the first time, despite the fact the lab was literally on wheels. But no, focus. RoboCop 3. At least RoboCop 2 is interesting enough to piss me off. RoboCop 3 just kind of slides right through my head. The worst part is we never see these rehab centers that we hear so much about, which allows the audience members to wonder, as we wander with Nico through the decimated streets of Detroit, now played by Atlanta. Why wouldn't anyone want to leave this version of Detroit again? And then make the same 2 or 3 Detroit jokes that everybody makes. If Roger Ebert's review of RoboCop 2 is anything to go by, the last movie was already too subtle about drawing a parallel between OCP and other previous fascist regimes. That's why, while other people are getting mad at various and sundry other continuity errors, I'm over here getting mad that the Rehab's logo, it's all wrong. For Christ's sake, they had the flag all ready to go in the last movie, and oh look, here are the brown shirts in this one. Brown shirts under body armor with fake muscles on it, for some reason. Somebody have Batman envy? But if we're taking bets on who in this franchise might want to put their brain in a robot body, my money's still on the old man. Except he apparently got himself fired at some point between movies. Replaced by the usually great Rip Torn, in an act of miscasting that, while not a capital crime, is at the very least a misdemeanor. He yells at people, like Rip Torn's wont to do, but he suffers for not playing the main villain, or even really the secondary one. He's playing a cog in the machine of capitalism, so vast that it transcends nations, and actively seeks to tear down all the borders that stop money from moving around, even as it erects literal walls to keep human beings as locked down as possible, and pawns off all of its negative aspects onto racialized stereotypes. Oh, you know, Japanese businessmen, they're just so greedy and inscrutable, and probably in bed with the mob. Not like American businessmen. No. Please ignore these totally unrelated pictures of Dick Jones and Clarence Boddicker being chummy. I'm just mad we don't have Dan O'Herlihy to kick around anymore. And that Nancy Allen only came back because they promised her what every actor craves, a sweet death scene. Her reintroduction sees all the cops at their local greasy spoon hangout joint chant her name, and these days I yell at the TV, yeah, you assholes better chant her name. She gave you all a RoboCop you could actually work with. We have a statue of Murphy in our Detroit, and I just hope that there's a statue of Lewis in his. Her death scene is the one time I have a legitimate gripe with the way Robert John Burke plays his role. He doesn't emote enough, and you can't blame all of that on the fact that he only has half a face to show the camera most of the time. About the only time Weller's Murphy raised his voice was when he thought his partner might be dying, and I still like that little sigh of relief he gives when she pokes her head up out of the mud. Burke's Murphy should at least scream. A nice big no would have been appropriate, given genre conventions and the timing of this movie's release. Or maybe I just think that, because the truncated Lewis and Murphy show we get here is an unfortunately boring retread of the last movie. As is the entire first half hour, if we're being honest. Oh look, here comes another walking sexual harassment lawsuit from Security Concepts, looking to take away Murphy's emotions by taking away the memories that power them. Oh, except this one's played by Bradley Whitford, years before he joined the Bartlett administration. It's still painfully obvious that he didn't read his briefing packet when he got the job. If he had, he might have learned that they tried all of this in the first movie, and it didn't even take past the second act. How can you interface human components with a machine and then complain when the human makes a decision? Murphy's newest basement-dwelling lab coat, Dr. Marie Lazarus, asks future Josh at one point. And that's a very good question, Dr. Lazarus. Somebody should have asked kindly Dr. Fax that, though I don't know if she would have even understood the question, to be honest. And I can think of several characters in the RoboCop remake who needed that asked of themselves. But we'll get there eventually. Also, Dr. Marie Lazarus? Seriously? Oh yes, Marie Lazarus. Harvard Med, class of alternate 1985. Graduated third in her class. behind Doctors Joseph Iscariot and Luke Magdalene. Interned at the Mayo Clinic under Dr. John T. Baptiste. Thank you. I'll be here all night. Tip your waiters. There's still a plague on. By effectively work-stopping future Josh's plan, Dr. Lazarus proves my theory that the Hippocratic Oath still exists in RoboCop world. So that's something. She gets more screen time than her lab-coated predecessors, and uses it to great effect. Though mostly just to nerd out with Nico, and play Mother of Mercy to Murphy. That way, Nico can act with an actor who doesn't need to get dressed in 60 pounds of physically painful suit for every scene. And Murphy can spend most of the second act splayed out on a table, just like last time. Marie even gets a stirring speech at the end, broadcast to all of Detroit thanks to Nico's technical acumen. A speech I dearly love, since every word of it is true. A clarion call to all citizens of Detroit to rise up against OCP's incursion into Cadillac Heights. Because if they take one neighborhood, your neighborhood is next. And what better place than here? What better time than now? Workers of Detroit, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And this is the part where most RoboCop 3 reviews get bogged down in continuity errors. Like how Murphy somehow got all of his directives back between films, except 4 is no longer classified. And then Marie deletes 4, seemingly, while she puts Murphy under for a quick heart transplant. So, what was the point of having them all back again? Especially since they only come up in that one scene where Murphy's deciding to side with the rebels against the rehabs. Oh wait, that was the point. Well, okay. If Automo has any directives, we certainly don't see them, and there goes the last chance to establish a parallel between etc., etc., etc. There's lots of little things like that, none of which really matter so much as the root cause of them all. Director Fred Decker is on record saying he had as much creative control over this as any director could want, given the circumstances. But the circumstances behind this movie's production were dire, and that's as painfully obvious as the arm Robert John Burke is trying to hide behind his back in the scene where Automo supposedly cuts off Murphy's left arm. Decker's gone on to blame this film's critical and commercial failure on it being too, quote-unquote, left-wing. And, as an actual lefty, I have no idea what he means by this. Like, left-wing as opposed to what, Fred? As opposed to, say, Frank Miller, whom you apparently had right there the whole time, at least according to him, and whom you apparently ignored so hard that he swore off making movies for the next 12 years. Like, left-wing as opposed to, say, 4 out of 5 Dirty Harry films, including the one that inspired Miller to create Sin City in the first place. Okay, I'll buy that for $1. Left-wing as opposed to that other trilogy about a cop from Detroit, Beverly Hills Cop. Left-wing as opposed to Bill Clinton. I mean, again, I'll buy that for $1, but his whole thing was, doing third way politics, which just meant, oh, yes, Democrats can take tons of Wall Street money too. Yeah, it's fine. Pharmaceutical money? Yes, please, bring it on in. Yeah. Oh, no, don't worry. We're not getting anybody any health care. No, fuck them. They'll get tax rebates, and they'll like it, because what are they going to do, vote Republican? Please. I think the real problem is that there is no left wing in my country. At least not an organized one. And there really hasn't been since organized labor lost the protection of the executive branch of the federal government. I mean, yeah, right-wingers call everything they don't like, far left or radical left, but that's more a function of their grand propaganda project to gain more power by working the so-called referees in our so-called democracy. That is, you, the viewer at home, ordinary people, and the news media ordinary people consume to figure out, or at least try and figure out, what the hell is going on. Because how else are you going to do it? With what resources? Especially when you have to waste all of your time worrying about being one paycheck away from homelessness. Working a shit job that perpetually schedules you for 35.5 hours a week so the bosses can avoid handing out even the meagerest, most stingy pack of benefits in the entire westernized world. And then you get home, you turn on the TV, and all you see are people bitching and moaning about far or radical left politicians who were and are about as radical and left as Joe Lieberman, or Joe Biden, for that fucking matter. And since they've completely abdicated any responsibility to address any kind of economic questions, the only thing they can really do is try to take away the few creature comforts that our shithole psycho country offers. Like high fructose corn syrup, cigarettes, and violent video games. None of which they really could take away, even if they wanted to, since all of those things make too many rich people even richer. But, again, facts don't matter. It's what you do with the facts that really matters. Sorry. All of which is to say, I think the fact this movie sat on a shelf for an entire year, a year in which Jurassic Park came out, no less, has a lot more to do with its failure than its incoherent, self-contradictory politics. Yes, this is the film where OCP calls a fascist pogrom force down on Detroit's head at the behest of their new Japanese masters. A right-wing fantasia of the 1980s, if ever there was one. But it's also the film where RoboCop joins a popular domestic insurgency against his corporate owners and their fascist pogrom force. For the first time since the end of the first film, the people hiding in the dilapidated Detroit factory are the good guys. The decorations inside the rebel base indicate that RoboCop 3 is technically a Christmas movie. So, next time somebody wants to get annoying about Die Hard, you can just go, oh yeah? So what? RoboCop 3 is a Christmas movie. Big fucking deal. And then not watch this, because, yeah, you really shouldn't. Or if you do, skip to the end, because that's where all the good stuff is. Like all those good one-liners I mentioned, and the scene where RoboCop has to commandeer a pimpmobile. Because RoboCop in a pimpmobile? I'm sorry, but that's funny, and you're not going to change my mind. And like the American Jesus he was created to be, this is the movie where Murphy seems to inspire all of his fellow officers to join him by the end, through little more than example and force of personality. For the first time in any of these films, we actually get to see the cops walk out, with Sergeant Reed himself leading the charge. So at least somebody's developed over the course of these 3 films. Reed gets a nice moment here, talking about having to face his own family. And it feels like the perfect culmination of his arc. From police officers don't strike, to that one good scene he got in RoboCop 2, where his voice broke as he called Murphy one of mine, and told the last walking sexual harassment lawsuit from Security Concepts that I want him back on his feet. Johnson gets his best moment here as well, impotently chiding the cops as they walk out past him. Though even that's a bit of a continuity error. You can't do this, he says. And I'm like, dude, they've done it twice in as many movies, which you were also in. Like, you should be the one telling McDaggett about how radicalized this police force already is, and that asking them to join the rehab team and actually uproot the very people they're sworn to serve and protect might just radicalize them further. Which it does. Leading the cops to join the rebels in the most out there science fiction-y plot point in this entire franchise. But there I go, doing that thing I criticized other people for doing. pointing out continuity errors in a movie where you can see the wires holding up a rehab's gun as Murphy supposedly shoots it out of his hand. Where you can see the blue screen outlines in every shot of Murphy and his new jetpack. Where you can see plenty of things that tell the shadow story of RoboCop 3. The story of a production rushing to get as much movie in the can as possible before somebody shut the studio's power off for failing to pay the bill. The story of a film whose video game tie-in came out a whole year before the film itself. And was, if anything, better. Even on the Super Nintendo. At least this one feels like a real movie, as opposed to a supercut of several TV episodes. It's not a good movie, but it is a good excuse to talk about the history of militarized police forces and xenophobic economics. So, guess that's something. I love where it gets. And it gets to the point of grandmas fighting SWAT teams with Uzis. 30 minutes of boring retread. Another Xerox sequel, TMCR Chad Denton 2020. Followed by the actual conclusion of this franchise. At the end of all things, Rip Torn turns to his new boss and says, "Let's start a scotch smaller. Let's gentrify this neighborhood. Build strip malls. Fast food joints, lots of popular entertainment." And I have to laugh at this, but it's a nervous laugh, since that's exactly what's happened to pretty much every American city since this movie came out. It's so ubiquitous, in fact, that nobody would dare to make it a villain plot today, or even as a button-up joke at the end of a villain plot. So I have to laugh, because otherwise, I get too depressed to work, and that's why these things take so long. RoboCop is a documentary, but the original RoboCop Trilogy is the template for pretty much every superhero franchise to come. Far more so than Christopher Reeve's Superman films, and predating the downfall of 90s Batman films by 3 whole years. It's further proof of Sansagene's comment in X-Men Apocalypse that the third one is always the worst. Though I still take issue with that statement. Because what happens when you make a RoboCop movie that takes economic questions as far off of the table as the entire rest of the American political system? Let me spoil it for you. Outlook, not so good. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like this review, hit the like button, and the subscribe button, and the little bell next to the subscribe button, so you can see the next one. And if you really like this review, consider supporting the show on Patreon, like the fine people whose names I'm about to read right now. Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G. Next time, oh, you already know, we're on an express elevator to hell, going down.